Hello and welcome to the Week in 60 Minutes, brought to you by SpectatorTV and broadcast on Thursday, the 23rd of November. I'm Katy Andrews, the Spectator's economics editor, and your host this week. Coming up on the show, did the government really cut taxes yesterday? I'll speak to former Chancellor Kwasi Kwarteng. Is the autumn statement enough to turn the polls around for the Tory party? Katie Balls and David Miles will join me. Will a humanitarian pause be an inflection point in the war in Gaza? I'll speak to Anshel Pfeffer and Eugene Rogan. Why did Peter Hitchens go to jail? I'll speak to the man himself. And finally, why you should be reading C.S. Lewis with A.N. Wilson. Before we get going, subscribe to The Spectator in our flash sale, and you'll not only get your first 12 weeks in print and online for £12, but you'll also get a bottle of Johnnie Walker Black Label whiskey absolutely free. It's only available within the UK, and you must be 18 or older. And a big thank you to our sponsors, Canaccord Genuity Wealth Management. Canaccord are experienced wealth planners and investment managers who offer unwavering support during challenging times. To find out more, visit candowealth.com for more information. First up, Jeremy Hunt wanted yesterday's autumn statement to prove that he was a tax-cutting chancellor. Has he convinced the public and his fellow MPs, including this former chancellor? I'm joined now by Kwasi Kwarteng. Kwasi, thanks for joining Spectator TV. You say in a piece for the Daily Telegraph today that you broadly welcome the measures in the autumn statement. So what do you broadly make of it?
Yes, I think it was a step in the right direction, and that's what I've written about in the Telegraph. What I liked about it was that I think it was the first time since Rishi Sunak was first appointed to the Treasury that we've seen some tax cuts for business. I was very pleased to see the NI cut, the NI tax cut from 12% to 10%. I was also pleased to see investment allowances, the permanent basis of that for business. And I think that it was the first step actually to show, as they've said all along, Rishi has said all along, he's a tax-cutting Prime Minister. And I think this is the first time we've seen an indication of that. So I broadly welcomed it from that point of view.
The Chancellor's phrase yesterday, the autumn statement for growth, was reminiscent, to me anyway, of the growth plan, which is what you labeled your plan last year. What did you make of it when you heard those words yesterday?
Well, I was surprised that they boldly copied that language. But I think that his plan was a much more tentative one than the one we had, obviously. But I think he said that, and I think he thinks that, given what happened last year in the markets, I can see the need for caution. But the underlying problem remains the same. You can't simply grow at 0.5 or 1% and hope to sustain 4 or 5% annual growth in public expenditure. There comes a point where you either have to increase taxes or borrow more, which leads to more taxation in the first place, subsequently. So the fundamental problem remains the same. We're a relatively low growth country at the moment. The fact that we're growing faster than the Eurozone, which the Remainers hate to be reminded of, for me is neither here nor there, because we're both very slow runners. And to say that you're the fastest of people among people who can't run very fast is neither here nor there. You've got to look at what's happening in the US and Asia, which are really driving growth right now. They're getting 3-4% a year. And we can't simply just stumble along at 1 or 1.5%.
I want to pull up those growth figures. Our viewers will be able to see the graph now. The OBR has largely downgraded its forecasts attached to this autumn statement for growth, revised them upwards for this year, no longer predicting a recession. We haven't seen recession, thankfully, in the UK. They're predicting 0.6% growth this year, but next year, 0.7%. It isn't until the final year of the forecast that things look slightly better than expected in March, and these are still not terribly impressive growth figures.
And if your economy, as I've said, is growing, let's say at 1%, let's give them us the benefit of the doubt, 1%. You can't sustain public spending growth at 3, 4, 5%. It can't be done. And I think what Liz and myself tried to do last year was actually fundamentally tackle this growth problem. And I want to see the government, perhaps in the budget next year rather, be ambitious in that regard. But I understand the tentative steps, but at some point you've got to deliver growth for our country, because otherwise you simply won't be able to sustain public expenditure.
You're making this important point about if you want to cut taxes, you have to deal with the spending side of equation.
Yes, I believe so.
Many people think that is what was left out of the growth plan last year.
I mean, I remember, and I think Simon Clarke has written about this, all through the leadership campaign, we were looking at spending reductions. And spending, and it's not actual reduction, for those of you who are mathematically minded, we're not talking about absolute reductions, we're talking about first order reductions, that is slowing the rate of growth of expenditure. And I think that's really important because you need to be able to balance tax cuts with some spending restraint. It doesn't have to be one for one, but you have to show, in my view, that you're going to be very restrained in terms of the growth of public expenditure. Now, the plan last year was to do what we eventually decided to do, which I think was a mistake, frankly, was to do the tax cuts first and then have a subsequent statement outlining the spending path. But I think what should have happened, looking back, and hindsight is a beautiful thing, is we should have delayed the actual statement to November and then I should have presented a tax cutting plan, roughly along the lines that we did, but also with a serious plan for reducing the rate of growth of public expenditure, so that there was balance. Now, it wouldn't have to be pound for pound. I think, the numbers I looked at ahead of Liz's election as leader, there was I think a tax cut of about 35 billion. So we just stuck to the NI cut and the not raising corporation tax from 19 to 25%. We should have left it at that, and then we should have found perhaps 10 to 15 billion of savings across the spending period, and that would have been a net expansion of 20 billion. In the event, we had a 45 billion expansion on top of the energy intervention, and I think that did spook the markets. I mean, that's just a fact.
I want to ask you a few more questions about the autumn statement, but just very quickly on that energy price guarantee that you brought up, and we can have a photo of it here for our viewers. It was this table 4.1 in the growth plan in which markets were being asked to fund about £60 billion per every 6 months for that energy price guarantee. Now, to my knowledge, the former Prime Minister continues to essentially support that decision, says that was necessary. Do you agree with her that was necessary?
I think that it wasn't, actually.
Right.
But actually, you've got to remember also that the OBR figures changed. I was very conscious the sort of so-called 72 billion black hole that was leaked, ahead of or just after the autumn statement last year, the mini budget, if you want to call it, that disappeared because of fiscal drag. So by the beginning of this year, that 72 billion figure had almost disappeared. And as we saw this year, because of inflation and fiscal drag, the numbers were more benign. They were slightly better in terms of the public finances. And I think there was a case for simply hanging in there. But obviously, I didn't ultimately take that decision to resign or to be sacked.
Of course. But you think that asking the markets for that amount of money may have been what actually.
So look, I think you compound. I think there were just too many fiscal interventions, or too much fiscal expansionism. So it's one thing having the energy package that she announced, and I think broadly the market sort of understood where that was coming from. But then on top of that, to have the 45 billion expansion, I think that was something that was difficult to bear. And hindsight is a beautiful thing. I think Liz Truss was bold. I think we were bold. I think it was we were tackling the right question. But there was I think an interesting and valid questions to be asked about the delivery and the timescale. And things were unlucky. I mean, in the sense that just at the moment that the mini budget last year, the autumn statement last year landed, we were seeing unprecedented interest rate hikes in the Fed. So everyone said, there's almost dollar parity. It's a collapse of sterling. Every currency in the world at that point was very weak against the dollar. The yen was at a 50-year low. The euro was at its lowest ever, I think. So there was an international context as well. But I think, going back to the main point, I think you've got to show some credibility on spending restraint if you're going to have an advanced program of tax cuts. I've never been a Reaganite. I remember saying that to the Prime Minister. I don't believe that you can simply just reduce taxes and hope that they pay for themselves. Even if that were true, not enough people believe that for markets to be stabilized. I think intellectually you've got to have a discipline and show how you're going to restrain public spending growth while allowing that to tax cuts. I think the two have to go hand in hand.
Well, let me ask you about the public debt. We have another graph we can pull up here in which the OBR has essentially said that Jeremy Hunt is playing this very, very close to the line. Most chancellors give themselves much more headroom to meet their fiscal target to reduce that ratio between debt to GDP. The OBR has actually suggested that it's only if Jeremy Hunt were to unfreeze fuel duty that he might meet his target, and I think there's a lot of skepticism that that's
right.
That's ever going to happen. Does this worry you, or do you think that this is totally sustainable in a G7 country?
No, I think it's slightly concerning, because the issue that we face is, thank God we've avoided recession. But God forbid, if there is a recession, you'll see the tax revenues plummet. And typically, what the Keynesians call, the automatic stabilizers, public expenditure will go up. So the fiscal headroom that you have in a not even a recession, in a world where you have essentially flat growth, is very narrow. The fundamental problem poses itself. How can you sustain essentially flatline economic growth, or 1% economic growth, when public expenditure is going up 4 or 5% a year? And until you actually resolve that, i.e. until you actually get growth or you reduce spending, you're on a fundamentally unsustainable path.
The Tory party sent out a tweet yesterday from the Conservative account which read, "Conservatives cut taxes, it's just what we do," hailing the largest ever tax cut for workers. Do you think this was a tax-cutting autumn statement? And by that I mean, if we compare the £10 billion worth of tax cuts for national insurance to what's happening because of the 6-year freeze on thresholds, which the OBR estimates is going to rake in upwards of £40 billion of tax hikes, is it really reasonable for the Tory party to be claiming that they are cutting taxes?
I think every fiscal statement, in a way, does juggle in that way. So I remember last year, where we did have actual tax cuts, we also froze the thresholds, because that was something which was obviously going to get revenue. And the so-called 72 billion hole, as I said, disappeared because inflation was higher for longer, and the fiscal drag was even more effective. So you're right to say that in absolute terms, this wasn't necessarily net a tax cut.
Well, in absolute terms, we can pull up the graph here. The tax burden remains the same.
Yeah,
We're still on track for a post-war high.
Yeah, so again, this goes back to the fundamental problem. You're not going to be able to reduce the tax burden if you can't grow the economy substantially. That's the conundrum.
You said something interesting there. You said last year when we really cut taxes. Are you emphasizing the extent of the tax cut, or are you not so convinced by these particular tax cut measures?
Anyone with 2 eyes in their head who can read can see that the measures we had last year were very substantial, and that was arguably what the markets were concerned about, on top of the energy intervention, as you say. Yesterday, there were some tax cuts, but they weren't of the scale. And someone like Jeremy Hunt would probably say, well, look what happened last year. We had to proceed with more caution this year, and that's clearly what he's done.
You wrote in your Telegraph piece that some of the measures in the autumn statement reminded you of Gordon Brown, who you say tinkered endlessly with the tax code. It's not obviously the most flattering comparison to bestow upon the government.
But I try and be balanced. I mean, broadly, I welcome the measures. I think it was the first time, certainly with Rishi Sunak at the helm, that we've seen reductions. And let's not kid ourselves. Rishi Sunak would have been all over the autumn statement. I mean, I don't think there was a comma in that he wouldn't have had some input into. But I think if you look at the large list, I mean, I saw some things like, the 110 million for nutrient balance or whatever it was. There was some 7 million for an anti-Semitism unit, which is very laudable, but again, micro expenditure. I think there was a 3 million for an anti-racist policy or program. There were lots of little micro measures. And having written in newspapers, I think I even did something for this magazine at the time. What that did remind me of Gordon Brown. But you've got to remember, a lot of the political debate in the UK is about the ministers. The Chancellor did this, the Prime Minister did that, the Secretary of State did that. But actually, underneath it all, there's a permanent, semi-permanent civil service. And so a lot of the style, a lot of the preoccupations of the departments last a lot longer than the individual ministers. I mean, I was in Treasury for, God knows, 5 weeks. Jeremy Hunt will be probably, even if Rishi wins, would probably be moved on. I don't know. We're there for quite a short time, but actually there's a continuity with the civil service that, Yes Minister famously, that TV program famously shone a light on, but people are not aware of. And I think the style of Gordon Brown's approach is still very much, part of the Treasury's makeup. And so it's not surprising to see some of his style reflected in statements even today.
You've made a big point of saying it's just simply not sustainable to have growth around 1% and to have public expenditure rising and rising and rising. And we know it will, not least because of the National Health Service and the state pension. We know these costs are only going to go up.
And I'd like to say, Kate, I mean, the polls are suggesting some sort of Labour government. I'm not convinced that's true, but let's take for granted that Labour get in. Their propensity to cut spending, I think, is zero. I think they're very unlikely.
But I want to ask you about the Tory prospect, because one could look at this past government, all its iterations, from Boris Johnson to Liz Truss to Rishi Sunak, and they could also say, well, the chances of a Tory government cutting public spending are virtually zero. And this focus on growth is so that ideally we don't have to really cut public spending. But is this Tory government showing signs that it will go for the supply side reforms? It's not talking about housing. It's not talking about serious efficiency gains in the health service. I take your point. Perhaps Labour wouldn't cut spending, but can you or anyone else in the Tory party at the moment credibly say that the Tory party would do that?
I think you ask a huge question, and I also believe that this is really the tough stuff. Anyone can spend more money, anyone can announce tax cuts, but I think for the Tory right, my free market friends, they've really got to ask questions about spending, and they've really got to be bold about spending and restraint. And I think that's something that we missed last year, or certainly the markets. I mean, Liz has said, it was all fully costed. It wasn't. Or certainly the markets didn't believe that. The people examining that, and they didn't believe that. So I think we've got to be credible about that. And, an excuse for the last few years, we did have a COVID, a global pandemic, which actually was the one thing that blew apart any kind of spending restraint. Because, we spent something like 300 billion in 1 year on the COVID support. Now we can argue whether that was the right thing or the wrong thing. But that's what happened. And much of the debate around public spending now, certainly in the 2020s, has been driven by what happened in terms of the COVID interventions.
Because put emergency intervention aside, it's that day-to-day spending that the Tory government seems to like to raise.
No, but you see, you can't really put it to one side, because certainly when I started in Parliament, the welfare budget was bigger than the health budget. That isn't the case now. The NHS spending, I think, is the biggest single item in public expenditure. And that's obviously related not only to demographic demand, ongoing demand, but also to COVID. So I don't think you can disaggregate the effects of COVID on public expenditure from, as you put it, the current day-to-day need.
We won't speculate about the polls. Who knows what's going to happen next year? But as already mentioned, in this Tory government, we've had several versions of leadership. We've had Boris Johnson's cakeism. We've had Liz Truss's, let's call it, radical optimism. We have Rishi Sunak really getting into the details. Almost regardless of what happens next year, what do you think the next vision for the Tory party should be?
I think we've got to be intellectually more engaged with the harder questions. For me, yes, we all believe in tax cuts. We all believe, or many of us believe, in a smaller state. But how do we actually get there? Which taxes should we be cutting first? There's an argument, and that's what I liked about the autumn statement yesterday, was that they were reducing business taxes, a bit of income taxes, to encourage the investment. But there's got to be a staged and processed look at tax reductions, but also a question that I know you're very interested in, about what the state should provide, and also finding greater efficiencies. Because it's very much the Labour argument that by spending more money, somehow you get better outcomes. But we've got to be much more rigorous about public expenditure. And that's a debate that, looking back, I wish we'd had last year. We'd have been, I think, better to be bolder on public. We'd have had a lot of flack from the left, obviously. But I think we've got to be level with people on public expenditure.
Kwasi, thanks for joining me. Continuing on the autumn statement, I'm joined now by Katy Balls and David Miles, an economist with the Office for Budget Responsibility. Katy and David, thanks for joining me. Katy, you write for the magazine this week that Jeremy Hunt's autumn statement may be too little, too late. What do you mean by that?
Well, it's one of three options I posed in my question. Effectively, this is what MPs have wanted Rishi Sunak to do for a long time, which is cut tax. Wanted to do it when he was Chancellor. When he was Prime Minister, they wanted him to do it. But every time, Rishi Sunak has always said, I am a low-tax Tory. Each time he says that, I think his MPs have believed him a little bit less. But he's made the case that he had to when the public finances are right. And this autumn statement, I think, is meant to be that moment, the start of a new chapter by which, from here, they will try and reduce the tax burden. The fact that they have chosen to do so now, I think if you just look to what Jeremy Hunt and Rishi Sunak were saying a few weeks ago, suggesting tax cuts would have to wait till the spring, that wasn't just trying to throw journalists off the scent. I think there was a feeling that they weren't sure there would be the headroom. And then I also think it's a combination of having more headroom than they expected and also having some political necessity, because Rishi Sunak is in a place where his party is pretty much tanking in the polls and his MPs are getting very anxious. So they've chosen to move now. The reason I think that for some this is going to be too little too late is even though the national insurance cut for employees will come into effect in January, which I think is earlier than many would have expected, people are still dealing with a cost of living crisis. You have the fact that the freezing of the thresholds means fiscal drag is something which is going to negate, I think, at least some of that tax cut. People still feel as though they're paying a lot more than they were a while ago. And therefore, by the time you get to the next election, and I think there will probably be more tax cuts before the next election, will people feel as though they're better off? And I think that's the big question.
David, a lot of people are speculating that this is the start, not the end of the tax-cutting agenda. But the OBR makes clear in its report around the autumn statement that the Chancellor has spent almost all of his fiscal headroom this time round. Now, perhaps the combination of inflation and the freeze on thresholds will give you even more fiscal headroom in the March budget, but he's already pretty close to the line.
I mean, you're right that the headroom at the end of the forecast horizon is pretty small. In an economy that's 3,000 billion, you have headroom of, on our central forecast, about 13 billion. So it's kind of wafer thin. I think it's a difficult position to start from, though, because we've had borrowing deficits until recently running at 5%. It's only a little bit lower than that, 5% of GDP deficit. Stock debt has gone up a great deal in recent years. You're trying to stabilize that, starting from a position with a fiscal deficit. What our forecast for the OBR suggests is that the way that that deficit comes down is that you squeeze government spending relative to GDP over the next 5 years by a couple of percentage points of GDP, and you increase the tax take out of GDP by a couple of percent of GDP, and that squeezes that deficit down from 5% of GDP, which would itself have meant that debt carried on rising if you stayed there, to about 1% of GDP 5 years down the road. That's a hard road to go down, and it involves tough decisions on spending and an increasing tax take out of GDP, and that just about stabilizes the stock of debt. So there's no easy way to go forward from here, given where we start from.
Katy, the Tory party is hailing its biggest ever tax cut for workers, its biggest ever one-off tax cut for business, but not everybody is so convinced. If you look at where the tax burden's actually headed to, it is still on track for that post-war high. How are Tory MPs responding to the narrative and what's actually been done?
So I think there is just a sense of relief that finally there is a tax cut, plural, even in front of them, because it has been put off for such a long time. So I think the initial reaction was quite cheery on that front. And the fact that when Jeremy Hunt addressed Tory MPs, he hinted again heavily that this was just the beginning and there'll be further tax cuts. I think when it comes to income tax versus national insurance, I think the narrative of a budget for the workers means that even though national insurance is probably a little bit less of a retail offer in terms of what they think they can sell on the doorstep, they think they're at least a coherent narrative. And there is relief that they didn't make their main giveaway inheritance tax as a cut, because I think there was a worry that if you were just doing that, which was floated at one point, it would really play into certain stereotypes about the Tory party. But it's very much this is a good start, but what have you got next? And I think the point that Jeremy Hunt tried to make when he addressed MPs at the 22 committee is that they shouldn't pretend they haven't raised tax, because I think in lots of these discussions, everyone's like, the tax burden's so high, the Tories have been in power so long, it's shocking. But there's also been a pandemic. And if you look at where lots of that cost is coming, you have furlough and you have the support for energy. And Jeremy Hunt said, let's not pretend we haven't been not been raising taxes, because we can defend the things we did. You can defend the decisions you made on furlough, on energy support. But we're now at the point where we can argue these decisions we're making are being done at the right time. And they're not going to be reversed like with the Liz Truss mini budget. So I think it's trying actually to thread these parts together so you have a coherent narrative by the time of the next election. Now, not all voters and not all Tory MPs particularly buy that argument. They're just annoyed at the tax burden. But I think that's what they want to get to saying.
David, UK living standards are falling dramatically. So why are they so low? Is it all the pandemic or something else going on?
Well, it's a combination of things. As Katy just said, there's two big things that have hit us in recent years. There's the pandemic. That was very bad for GDP, the economy, for standards of living. Increased debt a great deal and really necessitated then a rise in taxes if you're going to stop debt from rising. So that's one thing. And then just as one's coming out of COVID, we get this huge increases in imported energy prices, which the government, for good reasons, tried to cushion the blow of that on households. But you can't keep doing that. And so it's that combination of hits to the economy, hits to the standard of living, wages have only just begun to match the rate of inflation, but they've been lagging behind it for the last 18 months or so. So when you get these big hits to the economy, really there isn't anywhere to hide. They're just a reduction in the standard of living of the people of this country. Now, you might hope that over time you get a growth in productivity. We just get more productive at producing things, and that grows you out of the problem. But we've been hoping for that for 15 years since the financial crisis, and it hasn't really happened. Now, one could be optimistic that the last of the big shocks, for a while anyway, is behind us. So we might see some productivity growth and standards of living will rise. And I think that's plausible. That's not just wishful thinking. But it hasn't happened yet. And that's why standards of living have fallen and will fall for a bit more yet.
Katy, what do you think the government realistically expects to get out of these announcements from the public's perspective? Do you think they're expecting to see a big shift in the polls?
I don't think that they're really expecting a single event to have a big shift in the polls. Clearly, I think tax cuts are seen as not only a vote winner in the long term, but also a dividing line with Labour. And often Rachel Reeves and Jeremy Hunt sound quite similar on the economy. So I think it's going back to Tory basic principles and getting that path for the next election, which is if the Tories have spare money, they will use it to cut taxes. While Rachel Reeves, I think, has said the tax burden on working people is too much, and it does not feel as though she is going to oppose some of these tax cuts. She would, I think, oppose an inheritance tax cut. Is it the case that Labour's priority, if they do manage to grow the economy and get more money, is tax cuts, or is it public spending? So you start to go back to those traditional dividing lines. I think if they were just going for votes with this autumn statement, you probably wouldn't have had the super deduction, the full expensing made permanent. That is the most expensive measure in the entire autumn statement. As I think one Tory MP said, it's not particularly sexy when it comes to selling it on the doorstep, but it's something that if you look at comments by the CBI, I think lots of think tanks more to the right, and also some in Labour, they think it is just a sensible thing to do for growing the economy. So I think that's more of a long-term decision, whereas if you were just thinking, what do we do right now to swing the polls and give us the best chance? You would potentially done income tax and national insurance and so forth, more of a focus on personal taxes. I think when you get near an election, they will try and do more of that. But therefore, I think this is about actually having a coherent growth strategy while also politically trying to combine that with doing something to try and change the polls. But it's not the only reason for this budget.
David, there's of course a difference between the narrative that's put out, this is a huge tax-cutting event, and then actually what people feel. And what really jumped out at me from the OBR's report is that the OBR has emphasized the extent that fiscal drag is taking place. Millions more people by the end of the forecast are going to be dragged into income tax, into the higher rate of income tax, even into that 45p bracket. I think that's about 400,000 people. And people are going to be feeling worse off, even with this tax cut. Some people are not going to be feeling day to day as if they are in a better position than they were a few years ago.
That is true. The impact of freezing the thresholds, which is what really pushes people into paying tax for the first time or paying tax at a higher rate, actually generates lots of revenue over the next 5 years.
I think the OBR put it at 44 billion compared to...
It's 40 odd billion, that's right. Now, not all of that is income tax on labour income, but most of it is. And therefore the threshold freezing generates more tax revenue than the national insurance contribution cuts tax revenue. Of course, it's also true that since the threshold freeze was already in place, the marginal impact of cutting the national insurance rate is to reduce taxes. So it's both true that taxes have been cut, labour income taxes have been cut in the budget, but that taxes on labour income and the effective tax rate on labour income will likely be rising. They're both true.
Katy and David, thanks for joining me. In this week's cover piece, Anshel Pfeffer asks whether Israel can keep the support of its allies as it fights a war in Gaza. He says the IDF's window of legitimacy could be closing. To discuss, Anshel joins me now alongside Oxford historian Eugene Rogan. Anshel, you write for this week's magazine that for now, Israel is being allowed to fight this war in Gaza. But pressure has been growing from the international community to ease fighting. We now have a humanitarian pause. Give us your update.
Well, as we're speaking right now, we don't know yet when the pause will begin. It was supposed to begin on Thursday morning as part of the agreement brokered by Hamas's Qatari patrons. And there was supposed to be, from Thursday morning, a truce which would last for 4 days, during which every night Hamas was supposed to release about 12 of the hostages that they've been holding now for 7 weeks. For various reasons that were not quite clear yet, Hamas hasn't yet signed the deal. And as part of that deal, they were supposed to already have given a list of hostages to be released tonight. So that list hasn't arrived. Hamas haven't yet committed to the deal. The Israeli side is saying that these are just some technical things that are still being dealt with in Doha, the Qatari capital. And it'll probably happen tomorrow, but as we're speaking, it's still not happening yet.
Eugene, this humanitarian pause is supposed to allow for the exchange of 50 hostages for 150 Palestinian prisoners. What do you make of the potential deal?
Well, I think for many people on the Palestinian side, they're hoping it's an inflection point that is going to lead towards an evolution away from the military phase of the campaign and move into a diplomatic phase. 50 hostages out of an estimated 240 will leave 190 lives as yet unaccounted for. And apparently, as part of the deal agreed, there is a possibility of extending day by day this truce in return for the release of another 10 hostages a day. So I think that there is a possibility that we might be moving into a new phase. It's going to be very difficult for Israel to persuade the international community that a humanitarian pause followed by a return to carpet bombing is going to be a sustainable future. And this conflict has gone on already much longer than the past wars that Israel has had with Hamas in Gaza. And the pressure is building in the international community for an end to the suffering on the Palestinian side. So the pressures are there, and I think the way in which the truce itself plays out will determine whether this is indeed an inflection point or whether we're going back towards another stage of outright armed conflict.
Anshel, what has the reaction been like within Israel to this humanitarian pause? Who is supporting it and who is opposing it?
Well, many Israelis are simply waiting to see those children and their mothers come back home across the border after 7 weeks of uncertainty. And Israelis are also convinced, and almost all the polls are saying this quite clearly, that this is just a very temporary pause, not an inflection point. Israel has no choice but to try and eliminate Hamas's military capability. That's been done to a certain degree over the last 7 weeks, but it's still far from over. This is not a ceasefire. This is not an end to the war against Hamas. It's going to continue almost immediately after the truce is over. There will be some international pressure, but so far, Joe Biden and the main leaders of Europe, Rishi Sunak and Olaf Scholz, are standing up for what's right and are supporting Israel on this. And we've even seen in Britain that despite the really nasty protests we've seen on the street, they don't represent most of the British public. Keir Starmer, who's been standing upright against this as well, against any ceasefire, has actually gone up in the ratings in Britain the last few weeks. So it doesn't look as if there's a real pressure on Israel to stop the war. There'll be some, probably in the media, and people like Eugene, obviously, who don't like the idea of Israel destroying Hamas, will continue saying that there should be a ceasefire, but it's not going to, for weeks, at least after the truce, there'll still be an Israeli campaign against Hamas to the point where Israel feels that it can, that Hamas is no longer a threat, and the Israeli communities on the border of Gaza can return home.
Eugene, your thoughts on that?
Well, I mean, my thoughts are really irrelevant in the sense that I can reflect what I hear from a distance quite removed from where Anshel is viewing things from Israel. And I think the immediacy of the events when you view them from Israel is quite different from when you view them from Oxford. All I would say is that there is, I think, diminishing support for a conflict that continues to inflict such high casualties on civilians that bear no guilt for Hamas's atrocities. And I do think that that will put pressure on how much Israel can continue to do. We've already reached a point where the kill ratio of Israeli casualties versus those of the civilians of Gaza is 10-1. And one can't continue a military operation inflicting those levels of violence and not expect pushback, as though there is a kind of dual standard of life here. And there has to be a day after to this. At some point, someone's going to have to go in and address governance in Gaza, in a place where there are 2.2 million people, most of whom won't have a place to live and who have no means to provide for themselves. And the longer the military campaign goes on, the harder the day after will be. So those are real constraints, my views notwithstanding.
Anshel, is the Israeli government actually feeling the pressure to change the way that it's fighting, or is this mostly noise from Israel's perspective?
It is mainly noise. The problem when we address what the Israeli government is doing is that there isn't really an Israeli government in the sense as one set policy or strategy here. The Israeli government was already quite dysfunctional before the October 7 massacre. It's been dysfunctional more or less from when it was sworn in at the end of last year. It's a far-right, it's a group of far-right ultra-religious parties and a Likud party, which has ceased to be much more than Netanyahu's platform. And there isn't really any real strategy making within that government. There is strategy making within the Israeli defense establishment, but since they're not the ones who are making the ultimate decisions, that should be the politicians. It's really it's not much of a strategy that Israel can work with going forward. And the real problem, and this is where I totally agree with Eugene, is what happens with the civilian population in Gaza, because Hamas has, for 16 and a half years in control of Gaza, has built its military infrastructure to the length and breadth and depth of every part of the civilian fabric in Gaza. So there's no question that in an operation which is aimed at dismantling and destroying Hamas's military infrastructure, there has to be a dual strategy of what to do with the 2.3 million people living in Gaza. There aren't many safe areas there, so that's of course true. And the Israeli military began this campaign by warning people to go south of Wadi Gaza. Then recently, in the last few days, they've been warning people to move away from Khan Yunis, which is where the Hamas leadership is now holed they're holed in underground there. It's also the hometown of most of the Hamas leaders. At the same time, there isn't enough of a strategy for Israel how to deal with the 2.3 million citizens who can't leave Gaza. Egypt refuses to allow them even temporary respite across the border. I think what we will see in 2 or 3 weeks is much more pressure on Israel to deliver some kind of a plan for the civilians there. And this is where, and this is what I wrote in my piece in the Spectator, this is where I see the main threat to the support for Israel, is when I think people like Biden and the other Western leaders who have so far and still are giving Israel very significant support, when they realize that the Netanyahu government is seems incapable of delivering that dual strategy, not just the military side, but also the humanitarian side, this is where they'll start getting anxious. And I think some of that pressure may result not necessarily in Israel's ending the military campaign, but in some political changes within the Netanyahu government. We're already hearing threats from some of the far-right parties in the government saying that we won't agree for any type of aid to the Palestinians. And if Israel continues to even have this dialogue with the West over how to do that, they may withdraw from the coalition. And I think that will probably be the most important point in this war, as far as Israel's strategy changing. But for that to happen, I think there'll also first have to be some kind of political change. Netanyahu may have to ditch some of his partners. He may even be forced to resign himself. But that's how I see the pressure working out, rather than the pressure preventing Israel from continuing the military campaign, pressure forcing Israel to add also humanitarian strategy, and that will probably mean political change within the Israeli government.
Anshel and Eugene, thanks for joining Spectator TV. Peter Hitchens has learnt about the British justice system in a very personal way recently. He's here now. Peter, thanks for joining Spectator TV.
Pleasure.
You spent some time in prison lately. Tell us about that.
Well, it's very unpleasant, but I volunteered for it, so I can't complain. If you can't take a joke, you shouldn't have joined. Channel 4 came to me and said, would I take part in a reality experiment in as near as could possibly be recreated to a real prison. They'd hired a number of former actual prisoners and a number of actual retired prison officers, and they'd also hired a recently decommissioned prison in Shrewsbury. And they proposed to put us all together, those people and about 7 minor celebrities, such as I am, in these circumstances, and film us all the time, see what happened, see how we took it. And I've been quite trenchant about prisons over my life, and I still hold quite strong opinions about them, and I thought it would be cowardly of me to say no, so I said yes. A lot of people put up with it for a whole week. I would have put up with it for a week if I'd been asked, but they kept me out until the final 4 days. And that, I have to tell you, was quite enough. I was very pleased when it was over. There was there were moments of laughter and what you might call bonding and quite emotional moments, but it was never at any stage a pleasure and never something that you wanted to last any longer than it did.
To go back to the beginning, when Channel 4 approached you about this, you must have had some reservations. What made your principles, so to speak, trump the reservations you might have had?
Well, I didn't really. In a long life, I've learned that opportunities often come to you in unalluring ways. And
this is very unalluring.
You might as well take them. That quite often things which appear unalluring to begin with, journeys that you might or might not undertake, places you might or might not go to, it's almost always worth saying yes. So probably I was the least likely person to have misgivings about it.
You said you spent 4 days in Shrewsbury prison. How real did this simulation feel?
Often very real. The building is as it would be, and they'd very carefully made it as like the real thing as possible. The officers behaved as far as possible as they would have done, and the prisoners, I think, in many ways did rather nobly, because they saw it as a way of making some restitution for what they'd done. These are all former prisoners who stopped being criminals. Really entered into the spirit of it. They gave us as much as possible what we would have got if it had been real. Now, we knew that it was most unlikely that any serious violence would take place. We knew that other characteristics of real prison weren't there, and we also knew that ultimately we could get out. You could press the chicken switch, and someone would come and take you away. But it was very much discouraged, and you were told it would be very unwelcome. And I don't think anybody actually did that. but you knew ultimately. But in fact, you quite quickly forgot once you were in there that it was possible to get out. You became very convinced you were there by compulsion. You'd lost all power over your life. And the architecture, the power of architecture was one of the most underestimated arts. I always go on about it, but I have to say, being in a Victorian prison built with the purpose of impressing on the convicted prisoner that he has done wrong is quite an experience. The very bricks are talking to you, the shape of the archway of the door, the tunnel shape of the cell, the high window with a view of nothing except a chimney and the famous little tent of blue that prisoners call the sky. All that does have an impact on you, and the clanging of heavy iron and the stamp of booted feet on cast iron landings. It comes home to you and makes you behave and feel differently. Quite lonely and quite downcast.
You mentioned in your piece that the experience felt almost religious. Was part of that the setting?
I think yes. I think any serious experience of unpleasantness, of solitude, of self-doubt, and of fear, because there was some fear involved in it, I think it turns the mind towards God. If there's any room in your mind for God at all, these things will turn your mind towards Him.
I wanted to ask if you were afraid. Were you consistently afraid? Were there specific moments where you were
there were
afraid?
moments when I was afraid.
Yeah.
And these were people who had obviously been capable in their past lives of great violence. I didn't know who they were. We got a very sketchy introduction to who they were. They looked, in many cases, quite frightening. There were occasions when my very voice annoys people. And it just does. I have to be. As I've written in the article, I have to be careful on public transport late at night, speaking as I do. And my manner, the things that I say, they annoy people. And I wasn't totally sure. I don't want to cast any slur on anybody, because, in fact, I got a lot of generosity from the former prisoners. But at the beginning of it, I really wasn't sure where I stood with them, and I thought it was perfectly possible I might have an accident on the stairs.
Well, I'm sure our Spec TV watchers will be delighted to be listening to you, Peter. I want to talk about one session where you spoke with an ex-convict about drugs and addiction. Tell our viewers what happened in that very confrontational session.
Well, I didn't. I have two very unpopular opinions. One, that addiction...
Just two?
Addiction doesn't exist. No, I have lots, but on this subject, I have two particularly unpopular ones. One is addiction doesn't exist, which doesn't. It's an attempt to abolish free will. The whole use of the term in the way that it is used in the English language, which is, apart from anything else, extremely variable. And the other is that marijuana is not a soft and safe drug that anybody can take and without harm, but it is, in fact, probably the most dangerous of all the drugs. I decided I didn't want to, because I know it can get very boring, I didn't want to have a row about addiction in a prison, as I was sure that the idea that there is no real free will, that we're not really responsible for our actions, would be pretty popular among ex-prisoners, and not one I'd have an easy time dissuading them of. But on the other hand, when people started talking about marijuana as a soft drug, I thought, here I am, this may get onto television, I can't sit here, it would be cowardly to sit here and keep my mouth shut. So I said that what I think, that it's an incredibly dangerous drug. And a number of people became extremely angry with it. It's immensely strong, and it destroys the lives of children.
I can focus on things. I'm totally focused on things on weed. What you're talking is
How did it end?
Well, it ended with them storming out in that scene, but afterwards, for more than a few hours, I was getting pretty nasty looks from some of the people involved.
Peter, I don't know if you'll remember this. This was years ago. I was still in think tank world. You and I exchanged some emails about the gender pay gap.
Yes, I do remember.
And I remember after almost every email, you'd sign off your name and P.S. You're still wrong about drugs. Just so I remember, just so I was clear that we didn't agree on it.
The whole attitude of intelligent, educated people towards drugs in our society is an extraordinary thing, and it's done, as far as I'm concerned, an enormous amount of harm. So I keep at it where I see any signs of hope. If I think you should be flattered that I thought you were worth the effort.
Well, you made very clear on only on particular topics. We'll have that debate another time.
Sure.
My last question to you, Peter, is whether or not your views on British prisons have changed since going in.
No, because they're not what people think they are. I've never been a lock people up for the rest of their lives, bread and water, flogging person. I don't think there's any point in that. I think long prison sentences are futile. They destroy the souls of those who are subjected to them. I've seen inside quite a lot of prisons, and having done that, you can't, I think, really be human and believe that sending people to prison for very long periods of time is normally justified. Obviously, there are exceptional cases where people have simply to be kept off the streets. But I personally would rather be dead than spend 25 years in a prison. And that's just an expression of absolute opinion from what I've seen of them. So I'm not in favour of that. I think prisons should be austere. I think they should involve a lot of hard work, and I think that they should be full of the power of the state. The problem with prisons is that they're tough in the wrong way. They're not austere, they're squalid. They're chaotic, despite the efforts of the hugely outnumbered prison officers whose role in this is so often completely underestimated, and who keep things from becoming totally uncivilized in a way which ought to be more valued. But they are chaotic. They are increasingly under the control of the inmates. They're full of drugs, and they're full of suicide, and they're full of completely uncontrolled violence, and therefore there is no, in the place where the law sends people, there is no rule of law. In fact, there is no rule of authority. And so they're completely unfit for the job they're supposed to do. So I would have them, as I say, back under the control of the authorities, places of punishment, due punishment of responsible persons, as we used to call it, by the state, not people being punished by other criminals for not fitting in with them, which is what you get. And that you would have to have, and this of course reflects society outside, you would have to have a total exclusion of drugs. But it's very hard to exclude drugs from prison when society makes so little effort to exclude them from itself. Free people can take drugs. It's not surprising that prisoners are taking them.
This is actually my last question to you, Peter. Did it give you more or less faith in the rehabilitation system after prison, given that you were in there with ex-convicts? These are people who had now left prison. They were back in there. Presumably they were asked by Channel 4 to take on the role of acting like prisoners so that they could have the simulation. But in terms of the conversations you were having, the interactions, how did it change your views about rehabilitation?
Well, rehabilitation, like addiction, doesn't exist. There is no such thing, nor any record of it ever having happened.
You don't think people can rehabilitate?
People grow up and mature and tire of crime, or they cease to be able to run fast enough to get away after they've committed it. But I'm not in any case in favour of trying to change people's characters. The idea of rehabilitation, of working on someone to make him a different person, seems to me to be totalitarian. In a free society, you punish people for wrong acts. And make it plain to them that if they do them again, they'll be punished again. And you also make it plain to other people that if they do these wrong acts, they too will be punished. That's how free society treats the people in it who inevitably transgress. The whole idea of rehabilitation is repulsive to me, and I wouldn't be in favour of it if I believed it happened. But no, I don't. It doesn't change my view on that at all.
Can an individual choose to rehabilitate themselves?
Well, as I say, what do you mean by the word? Individuals can choose to stop doing bad things, and often do. But they do that for many reasons. They learn, for instance, that it's disastrous for their family life. They learn that it estranges them from their children. They learn that prison, however strong and tough you are, is never going to be a nice place, and they want to return to it. They change their lives while remaining the same people. And that suits me. I want people to remain free men and women. I don't want.
But that's the catch. It sounds like
broken.
It sounds like you're saying they can change their behavior, but not change their character. I guess yes. I'm just questioning whether or not perhaps a person could choose to change their character.
You'd have to ask somebody else. It's not something I know anything about.
Fair enough.
I seem to have been stuck with the same character all my life.
Peter, thanks for joining me. And finally, the writer A.N. Wilson writes in this week's magazine that 60 years after his death, we need C.S. Lewis more than ever before. Andrew joins me now. Andrew, thanks for joining me. It's now 60 years after the death of C.S. Lewis. What kind of a man was he?
Old-fashioned, I think, is the first thing to say, even by the standards of 1963, which most people agree was a kind of turning point in history. He was fixed in the pre-First World War outlook, really. I mean, I think that's, in a sense, the most important thing about him. He was born in Northern Ireland, which is quite a conservative-minded place anyway.
And he was a teacher too. What did he teach?
He was a don at Oxford. He was a university teacher. He initially taught philosophy at his old college, University College, and then after a year he became the English literature tutor at Magdalen College, which he did for decades. And then towards the end of his life, which was a short life,
Oxford was incredibly important to him. He was incredibly inspired.
Oxford was central to him. His friends nearly all came from Oxford. He scarcely left Oxford until he got that job in Cambridge. And in those days, there was a railway line between Oxford and Cambridge. They hadn't axed it. So otherwise, I don't think he'd have taken the job.
Really? You think he might have stayed?
I'm sure he would, because he went home to his house in Oxford every weekend.
Right. You start your piece for the magazine this week writing about how Lewis risked scandal because he spent time living with an older woman. What was his relationship to Mrs. Moore?
Well, as he was training to go to the trenches, they were put in Keble College, the young officers who were training, and it was alphabetical order, L for Lewis, and the next boy in the adjoining bed was called Moore, Paddy Moore. He was an Irish boy, like Lewis himself, and they formed a friendship, and they had this agreement which seemed like a kind of almost a joke, that if one of them died in the war, the other would look after the surviving parent. In Lewis's case, he didn't have a mother surviving. His mother died when he was 9, which again, you say what was important about him. That was, in a way, the crucial psychological factor in his life. Paddy Moore was killed, and Lewis, who'd stayed one weekend with them in Bristol, came home and formed this passionate attachment to Mrs. Moore. Minto, as he called her, named after her favourite sweet, which was a sticky mint. And Jane Moore, which was her real name, and he set up house together in just outside Oxford in a place called the Kilns, near Headington Kilns, a stone quarry.
This isn't his only relationship with a woman that has grabbed headlines over the years. You also write about his late marriage to Joy Davidman. Tell us about that.
Well, just going on a little bit about Mrs. Moore, it was a relationship which unravelled. They lived together, and the sleeping arrangements, which you can still see at his house, the C.S. Lewis Study Centre at the Kilns, she slept in a big bed and he slept in a little bed in the same room. But after he had a religious experience and became a Christian, having been an atheist, she was furious, and one can only assume that one of the things he decided to do when he became religious was to give up carnal relations with Mrs. Moore. But of course that's only an inference. She used to shout abuse at him out of the window as he crept off to Holy Communion. He then became this quite famous Christian apologist, and he used to get dozens of fan letters, particularly from the United States, and one of them was from this woman called Joy Davidman, who was in an unhappy marriage, who was struggling with alcoholism, which was also something very much present in Lewis's family, and who had lately herself moved from being a position of communist atheism to, broadly speaking, Christianity, very much inspired by him. And so she came over to see him with these two little boys, having escaped this violent and unhappy marriage. And in the course of that period, she got divorced from her husband. Lewis, wanting to give her a passport to England, offered to marry her really very early on in the relationship. At the time, it just seemed like an arrangement. They weren't living together. But somehow or another, and it is extremely touching, I think, because they're not very beautiful people, they're not stylish people, they're late middle-aged. He was a overweight, very, very heavy drinker, chain smoker, 60 cigarettes a day.
Oh my gosh.
With on top of his pipes, which were constantly being lit and relit. And she was a hard-drinking, foul-mouthed, modern kind of person, really not the sort of person you'd expect Lewis to have liked. And they fell in love. It's as simple as that, I think, really. All his male cronies, he was in this little circle called the Inklings. People like J.R.R. Tolkien, Hugo Dyson, Neville Coddiel, the great Chaucer scholar, they were all horrified. Dyson, quoting from Othello, used to say, "Accursed fate that gave thee to the Moor." But they were even more horrified when he decided he wanted to marry Joy, and he expected them to stop being male cronies and to join in with his domestic life. He had never shown the slightest interest. They were all married people, except for Neville Coddiel. He'd never shown the slightest interest in their wives, their children, their family lives, and he suddenly expected them to be interested in Joy. And he was obsessed by Joy. And it did mean the end of his friendships with most of his men friends, actually.
Oh, wow. So how did she affect his work? Clearly she affected his life hugely, but how does she affect his work?
Well, it's a hard question to answer that, because everybody who met her except Lewis loathed her. Because she was very abrasive, she was very rude when she was well. And there was one exception to this. He had an old pupil called Roger Lancelin Green, and when it was revealed that Joy was desperately ill with cancer, the Lancelin Greens took Lewis and Joy on a cruise in the Mediterranean. And that was obviously a completely wonderful summer when the four of them were together. And it was the closest thing Lewis really ever had to a kind of normal friendship, I think, that summer with the...
Do we know anything from his writings, any diaries, even his books, about why he loved her so much?
I think it was an intellectual thing to start with. He was impressed that this woman who had been a communist atheist was persuaded of the truth of the Christian religion by reading him. So there was a bit of egotism, probably. There was a passionate sexual attraction, which is very clear from what he writes about in his diary and in his letters to her. If you have to define somebody's sexual taste, he was a sadomasochist. As a young man, he used to sign his letters Philomastix, the lover of the whip. And
this is not the C.S. Lewis I am familiar with.
And he wasn't gay, but the professor of Greek, it was put in a recent book by Daisy Dunn about the Oxford in those days. Before the war, before the First World War, and they all went off, when he was an undergraduate, he used to go around undergraduate parties saying, "If I give somebody a shilling, will they give me a whipping?" So, he was obsessed by punishment, and she clearly was happy to enter into that, Mrs. David.
Lewis was writing when Hitler was still in power. How did the politics of the 30s affect his work?
It's a very good question, that. As you probably know, for a long time his best friend was J.R.R. Tolkien, and one of the things which put that friendship under threat was that Tolkien, like many Catholics at that date, sympathized with the fascists. And when the Spanish War broke out, the Spanish Civil War, he was wholly on the side of General Franco, whereas Lewis took the view, which he expressed very loudly once in an Oxford pub and somebody punched him in the face, famous poet called Roy Campbell, that the Republic in Spain, though communist and though atheist, was the elected government, which is true. He was pretty detached from the news. There's a very good entry in his brother's diary. His brother lived with them. It says, warning Lewis, a big row at breakfast with Jack, that's what he called Lewis. After about half an hour of shouting, we realised that Lewis thought that Tito was the king of Greece. So that's how much he knew about politics. Didn't stop him having very passionate arguments sometimes.
Andrew, thank you so much for joining Spectator TV. That's it for this week. Once again, if you enjoy Spectator TV, do subscribe to our YouTube channel. Just click the subscribe button at the bottom of this video and tap the bell icon to make sure you never miss an episode. I would also like to thank our sponsors, Canaccord Genuity Wealth Management. Canaccord are experienced wealth planners and investment managers who offer unwavering support during challenging times. Visit candowealth.com for more information. Thanks again for watching, and do join us again next week.